Hi everybody. I want to talk about slavery today. I've already talked a little bit about Bacon's Rebellion. This is a little bit of an extension of that, talking about the slave trade overall. And I kind of, in the last lecture, talked a little bit about this. But honestly, and I mentioned this last time, Bacon's Rebellion was the start of race-based slavery in the colonies, in the Americas, and what would become the United States. Of course, the U.S. did not exist yet. But, like it says, and I think this is a very powerful way to look at it. The southern colonies, after Bacon's Rebellion, went from a society with slaves to a slave society, an economy that was based on African slavery. Okay, and then, and not only that, based on African slavery. And slavery and race were linked forevermore until slavery would end in 1865. After Bacon's Rebellion, indentured servitude just basically died off in the South, and all slaves on southern plantations would be African, would be people of color, would be black. Again, one of the worst crimes of humanity ever in world history. So, the demand for slaves. Obviously, you look at these three very, very important crops in the South. And again, it's the whole economic idea of you want to keep labor costs low, because if you have to pay for labor, you're not going to rake in as much money. That's taking directly out of your profits. And what's better to a southern plantation owner than cheap labor? Free labor! That would be the answer to that, or I should say labor that you don't have to pay for. And these were extremely important crops. Cotton would be extremely important in the 19th century. In fact, slavery might have died off. There are historians who theorize that slavery might have died off if not for the cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney. And, of course, we'll look at that a little bit later on. Tobacco, which, you look at Kentucky, you look at Virginia, these colonies, these states, future states, would become extremely reliant on tobacco. And rice was very prevalent, especially in South Carolina. But really, slavery would exist for as long as it did, and the South would rely on it so much because of the production of cotton. But that wouldn't be for a while. In New England or in the North, you really didn't have that demand, because this was not, in the North didn't have an agricultural-based society. It wasn't based on agriculture. It was based on other industries. But we're not here to talk about the North. We're here to talk about the South right now. We talked about this a little bit last time. The slave trade was based on Europeans, or British colonials going to Africa, trading with African kingdoms for African people, putting them on ships, shipping them back to the Americas, and forcing them into slavery. And they were treated extremely horribly by the Europeans who traded for them. They were kept naked on these ships, these slave ships, cramped quarters, chained to the ship. They were only fed bread and water, and they were marked with a red-hot iron, denoting that you were, in fact, a slave. And these African kingdoms, what did they want in exchange for some of their people? They wanted goods. They wanted especially weapons. Some of these kingdoms traded for weapons so they could conquer more areas in Africa. So the slave trade was a way that they could gain more land and conquer more people and become even wealthier than they were. And also rum. They traded slaves for rum as well. But I think weapons is the most important one. It allowed the African kingdoms to become more powerful. This horrible voyage that the slaves took from Africa to the Americas was called the Middle Passage. This voyage took about 7 weeks. The slaves were, like I said, chained naked, shoulder to shoulder. I think a very good depiction of this is in the movie Amistad. The horrors of this are unimaginable, I should say. Slaves being given very little to eat, basically laying in their own feces. Many of them died, thrown overboard if they did not cooperate, drowned. So much so, you look at this figure, it's absolutely astounding. 25% of these slaves died on this voyage. And, you know, the rest, the 75%, the rest of them would encounter their own horrific experiences once they got to the colonies. And this is a very emotional picture for me. You look at this is what a slave ship looked like, a diagram of a slave ship. You look how closely quartered. I mean, every single space of this ship is taken up with a human body. Everybody just jam-packed into one space. No space is wasted, definitely. And all these people have nowhere to go. And again, if anybody caused any sort of problem, if anybody got sick, if anybody was spreading illness or spreading malcontent amongst the other slaves or threatened to revolt, they were thrown overboard, they were killed. This was a complete disregard for human life. And again, I think the white European traders, the captains of these ships, and this would kind of continue in the colonies, viewed these people as inhuman. Like, these were not people, they were animals, and they were treated as such to these, you know, these slave traders. Once in America, slaves were inspected. You know, you see videos of this. I think one very powerful movie. Honestly, I can't watch this movie. It's so disturbing. 12 Years a Slave, in which you see this depicted. You see, you know, slave traders inspecting slaves, opening their mouth, checking them, like, you know, for, I don't know what they were checking them for, disease, how good their teeth were, how strong they were, etc., how good they looked, what they would, you know, ideally be used for. And they were kind of treated like, I mean, they were treated like animals, like livestock. Absolutely disgraceful. And I don't even like talking about it, to be honest with you. Slave marriages and families were broken up through sales. This would continue through 1865 in the Americas. The slave trade with Africa would stop in 1808. But slaves were traded all over the place once they were in the Americas. So, you know, you could have a family that started out in Georgia, and then all of a sudden your family would be split up if the plantation owner decided to trade your children to somewhere else. This would happen for a good 200 years, just about. And it says right there, most slaves face a lifetime of slavery in the colonies. Usually you weren't going to achieve freedom unless A, you somehow bought it, or B, your master died, and in his will, he put that he would free you. He would free his slaves. George Washington actually did this. He was a slave owner, and apparently he was benevolent towards his slaves. In his will, he freed his slaves. Thomas Jefferson, another slave owner in Virginia, did not free his slaves in his will. Two very different individuals and two very different philosophies regarding slavery. And it's interesting to think about how we look at Jefferson in that light. I mean, you know, one of the greatest founding fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence, wrote the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." But did Thomas Jefferson live by those words that he wrote? Does America still live by those words? That's something we'll obviously debate. The treatment of slaves. As slavery went on, to keep slaves under control, because the United States, or the slave plantations, would go through many slave rebellions or attempted slave rebellions over the years. And every time one of these rebellions would occur, the treatment of slaves would become more brutal, obviously to intimidate slaves and to deter slaves from orchestrating slave rebellions. So slaves were whipped, they were branded, tortured, executed for punishment. I read one story during the Civil War. There was a slave that was tortured in front of his children, and he was decapitated. I mean, things like this would happen all the time. And this was supposedly to show his children that you should not run away. These are, and again, this person, this slave, had been caught. He had been caught trying to run away or trying to flee and trying to join the Union Army during the Civil War. But again, the idea behind some of this harsh punishment was to make examples of certain people who committed crimes against the plantations or who tried to run away, so other slaves would not get the same ideas. One of these rebellions, in fact the first one, was called the Stono Slave Rebellion, 1739, which was the largest slave rebellion before the American Revolution in the British colonies. 60 slaves walked off a plantation. They burned buildings, they killed whites, and they wanted to get to Spanish Florida. Again, Florida is called Spanish Florida because obviously Spain held Florida at the time. Florida was in control, under the control of the Spanish. And Spain had promised all escaped slaves freedom if they made it to Florida. So, of course, those slaves in Stono, South Carolina, they had their idea, like, okay, we're going to get out of here. If we make it to Florida, we're going to get our freedom. So slave owners sent South Carolina militia to stop the slaves. There was this battle at Stono, South Carolina. The rebels were killed. Some were returned to slavery. Some made it to Florida. So the results were kind of mixed amongst these 60 individuals who decided to revolt. However, I think the main thing that came out of the Stono Slave Rebellion was the effects. And the effects were that the punishment for slaves, or the code that would regulate slavery in South Carolina, became much, much harsher. The government of South Carolina stopped slaves from assembling with each other. They stopped the importation of slaves for a period of time. And they created stricter codes to prevent slave rebellion. So punishments got worse. Treatment got harsher because of the fear of another slave rebellion. So, punishments were a deterrent, essentially. And, the treatment of slaves would get even worse and worse and worse. You want to talk about, we talk about, oftentimes in pop culture, we talk about slaves being whipped or slaves being beaten. Some of these stories amongst Southern culture, amongst plantation culture, is not simply whipping. It's not simply beating. It's pure torture. It's burning at the stake. It's cutting people's heads off. It's public execution by hanging. It's killing children in front of their parents. I mean, all of these things, beyond the horrors of your imagination, took place on slave plantations in the South before 1865, and even after 1865, as the United States moved into a new period. Anyway, that's all I got to say today. I'll see you all tomorrow or sometime.